As you can see in the title, I'll be focusing on the hidden spaces of exclusion and hate in Brazil, to sort of like understand what was going on in the country, as you know, several people are wondering why, of all the countries, Brazil has chosen to go down that path, which seems a little dark. But hopefully today I'll give you some light, not in the end of the tunnel, but to understand what happened. But hopefully the light at the end of the tunnel will come. It has to come, right? So here's an outline of what I'll be talking today. I will be focusing a little bit on the social structure of Brazil. Talking about the fieldwork, as Chico mentioned, I'm an ethnographer, and because I've been doing work, ethnography in Brazil since 2013, I go back then to sort of explain how we came to where we are right now. Talk about two cases from the first ethnography that I did in 2013 and 14, which is the Jalezinhos and the 2013 protest. The Jalezinhos means strolls, like little strolls. And then I go to the second study, which is the newest project, which is on misinformation and WhatsApp during the elections in Brazil. I'll talk a little bit about the methods, but I'll focus mostly on the insights and the findings that I got from it. So how did I get into this presentation? Well, I was getting a little tired of people knocking on my door and asking, what the hell is going on in Brazil? It was a question that I was asking myself, given that we had the Workers' Party for about almost 16 years. It seems like Brazil was going towards a progressive path, and all of a sudden we ended up with a far-right white male president that goes completely against in the directions that we were going. For those who have been studying Brazil, it's very complex. It's a very loaded question, so you can't just answer with a simple answer. It requires at least 2 days to unpack everything that is going on. But here in my work, the way that I'm going to explain is to uncover exactly those hidden spaces of hate in Brazil, because oftentimes people perceive Brazil as this melting pot of cultures, of races, where everybody is happy together. It seems like the perfect place to promote diversity and inclusion. But in fact, what I'm going to show you is that it's actually the contrary. And unfortunately, these spaces of hate and racism and exclusion, they are they're put on the sides and the periphery, so people don't realize that these places actually exist. So my first work in Brazil was around the uses of technology by folks in the favelas, in the urban slums, because I was looking in the ways that they were appropriating technology as a way to gain access to society. But in fact, what I saw was that technology was amplifying some of that exclusion that was coming from already established sectors of society that was excluding them. So actually it worked as an amplifier of exclusion. So here's where I'm going now. I'm going to go show you exactly how exclusion happened on the technologies. And by uncovering these spaces, I will go into my WhatsApp research, and hopefully by the end you will understand how these hidden spaces of hate and racism kind of connects to Bolsonaro and what we're living today, okay? So if you feel like what I'm showing you has nothing to do with Bolsonaro, I hope in the end it will come in full circle and we'll be able to make those connections. So like I said, I focused on the favela residents, or the marginalized, as we know in Brazil. And in Brazil, the way that our society is classified is based on social class, which is based on monthly income, so household income. So we basically have 5 social classes, A, B, C, D, and E. And those who live in classes C, D, and E can be considered the lower classes. However, given the social efforts of the past 3 to 4 governments, which was the Workers' Party government, Class C it got inflated and became the new middle class, to the point that it got so inflated that it had to be divided into 2. So we have C1 and C2. So basically those who are in C2, D, and E are the ones who inhabit the favelas and the slums and the people who interacted here. Just to give an idea who these people are in terms of the population, people in classes C, D, and E comprise of almost 88% of the population in Brazil. But when it comes to access to internet, computers, they're only 25%. So there's a huge gap in access to computers and digital devices in the country, as well as content on the internet. As Chico mentioned, I'm from Victoria, and I decided to do this field work in my hometown. I actually wanted to do it in Rio de Janeiro. Like when you think of favelas, you think of Rio, right? If you've seen City of God or Elite Squad, these are all movies that happen in the slums of Rio. And I did try to do that. I had about a month exploratory work over there. But as soon as I stepped foot over there, they invited me over and said, we have all of the answers to your questions, although I haven't even asked them anything. So that's what in anthropology we call them, they've been over-researched or domesticated by researchers. So they were no longer, let's say, having the essence of the purity that I was after. So Victoria, because it's understudied, I decided to go there. So Victoria is the capital city of the state of Espírito Santo. I can use this TV here. It's right here. That's the southeast region of Brazil. For those who don't know, that's the richest region in the country. It's really hard to compete. Like Victoria feels like it's the red-headed child of Brazil because it's hard to compete with the regions, especially because Rio, São Paulo, and Belo Horizonte, which are the other state capitals in the southeast region, are the three largest cities in the country. So Victoria ends up being like marginalized in terms of attention. So I decided to go back there. One, because Victoria has a lifestyle similar to Rio de Janeiro. We also have slums, and it's understudied and underrepresented. So that's where I went. As I mentioned, Victoria is an island. It's barely an island, but it is. We're very proud of it. As you can see, there's a stream that goes around it. It's inside of a bay. It's a very rich city. It has the highest GDP per capita and also the second highest Human Development Index in the country. However, these numbers are misleading because Victoria also has the second highest concentration of wealth, which means that the rich is very rich, but the poor is very poor. So this is just to give an idea of how this wealth is divided. So here's like the coast, we call it the East Coast. So on the coast, the darker is the blue, the richer are the people. And of course the lighter is the blue, the poorer is the people. So you can see that there seems to be a concentration of wealth on this side. And because I was looking specifically at where hidden places of racism and hate was in my hometown, I decided to go beyond wealth because that's how social class is divided in Brazil, so that's not news that this was happening. I wanted to know about race. And this is the map that I got. So I got the data from the census, and of course, the lighter is the color, the lighter is the skin tone of the people. And as you can see on this side, it seems like people are either the, as we call in the census, the blacks and the browns are over here. And there seems to be almost like a one-on-one overlap between these two maps, right? So of course, the whites are rich and the blacks are poor. So I did have a conversation with the mayor of Victoria, and I showed this map to him to sort of like try to understand where this sort of racial wealth divide was happening. He said that, well, Brazilians have this weird thing that we think that we don't have racism. We have a problem with class, but we don't have a problem with race. But when you come across a map like this, then you see, no, we do have a problem with race as well. He looked at me and then said, yeah, I think you're onto something, but did not provide anything more than that.
It's like a clarification question. Is this part of racial divisions in society, is part of the Brazilian constitution?
What do you mean?
So you pointed out that the lighter colors are white skin
Yeah.
tone, darker ones obviously the darker skin tones. How do you classify them? Who is white and who is black?
Oh yes, we have what is called the IBGE, which is the entity that takes care of the census, and they're the ones who come up with these classifications. The right term to call blacks in Portuguese is negros, but the translation in English is inappropriate, so I stick with blacks.
So it's part of the constitution of this, or government discourse, let's put it this way.
Correct. I wouldn't say constitutional, but part of the classification that comes from this entity, yeah. So as you can see, there's a problem here of race, obviously. What is interesting is that in this green line here, it's an avenue, which in my work I theorize, and in American English we have this term on the other side of the tracks. I try to theorize on the other side of the avenue where things get unnoticed and push the periphery outside this avenue. We'll go back to this avenue later on as I present the cases. So going back to the map of the city, the favelas, these slums that I focused on, was right in the center of the island. So it was not in some sort of like peripheral part of the city. However, even though they were at the center, they were still marginalized by, telecom companies that bypassed this region by not providing proper signal to the folks who lived here. They thought it wasn't a profitable market or profitable territory that was worth installing the antennas. What was interesting though was that because it was on a hill, the antennas were on top of the hills, but it worked like an umbrella, so you bypassed them on purpose. So as you can see, the digital inequality was not only based on wealth, because they couldn't purchase the latest goods or purchase a data plan, it was because of lack of service provided to them. So again, this was the slum that I focused on. Is a complex of 5 different neighborhoods, and the avenue that I told you about, it's right here. So you can see that it divides literally where the slums begins and where it ends. Here's another photo of the favelas. For those who don't know, favelas in Brazil are usually on hillsides, and that goes back to colonial times. Back in the days, flat lands were the prime lands in the country because Brazil was a farming country for a long time, and hills are not good for farming. So when the slaves were set free, they were not given any sort of reparation or land or any plan to how to conduct their lives after being set free. So the only empty lands that they could go to were on the hillside. So hence a concentration of blacks in these regions. So it's historically, it's not something new. Favelas are usually organized in this sense. So at the bottom, they're more city-like. So that's where you see the shops, the markets. It's a bit more urbanized. In the center, that's where you see, in the middle, that's where you would see the houses, so the shack houses. If you see in City of God, again, the back alleys, the very narrow back alleys, that's where it happened. That's where people live. And I don't know if you could see here, but on top, it seemed pretty empty. And I don't know if you guys can take a guess of why that was empty. Anyone? Any guesses? It's all right. That's where the drug cartel was installed. And this was specifically in the slums of Victoria. But in other slums, in the favelas in Rio, they're also established at the top because they use all kinds of warp tactics. It's a better space to be, to visualize and control your area. They could watch when the cops were coming up, and so they could prepare. And also, this field work I did in 2013 and 14, which was the worst time to do field work in a favela, especially in Victoria, because as Brazil was getting ready to host the Olympics and the World Cup, the pacifying process that was happening in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo were trying to arrest. So basically it was a social cleansing, but they were arresting the drug lords and people who they thought belonged to drug cartel. So those who managed to run away, they came to Victoria, and and they already put themselves at war with the established cartels that were already there. So, of course, they wanted to continue their business. They had new customers, so they partner up with different cartels in the city. So something that was already established and had agreement, so they didn't have a war between them, exploded into a drug war because of the new people coming in. So that was something that I didn't anticipate, which made fieldwork very interesting. But I survived, and I'm here to tell you the story. I focused mostly of my fieldwork in community technology centers, and by community technology centers I mean telecenters, which are state-owned and state-supported computer facilities in poor areas where they don't have access to internet and computers, as well as LAN houses. LAN houses are like coffee, cyber cafes here in the West, but they're more than that. It can also be seen as a gaming center, and that's why I try to theorize them as community centers, because it goes beyond just access to technology. There's a lot of peer-to-peer learning. There's a lot of community-geared activities happening in these technology centers. So LAN houses were private businesses. It was owned by local favela residents. As you can see, it was an extension to people's homes, so that's why it was located right in the middle. So I visited 2 LAN houses and 2 telecenters. One was right at the base, so it was really easy to access. The manager of the telecenters, she was housed here, so it was really easy to talk to them. And it was easy to get access to this one than the second one, because it was right at the top. For here, I had to negotiate with cartel members, make sure that they knew that I wasn't like a new drug dealer coming into the scene or being an undercover cop. He required a whole lot of more work than just entering these facilities. So as I mentioned, I did most of the work in 2013 and 14. Went back in 2015 for more follow-up ethnography. It was a total of 105 semi-structured interviews, 8 focus groups that happened inside these technology centers. But my observations went beyond these centers and happened also in the slums as a whole. So, as for community technology centers, so I'm now going to start telling you the story of these hidden spaces. So computers at these centers were heavily used for Facebooking and entertainment purposes. My informants from all age groups spent most of their time on Facebook chatting, watching videos, listening to music from YouTube, playing Facebook and other Flash-based games. The popularity of Facebook was surprising because Orchid was Brazil's number one social networking site until 2012, as mentioned by Jose. He says, nowadays you have to have a face, so they call Facebook face, to connect to people on and offline. No one asks for your phone anymore. They all want to know if you have a face. As the lower classes in Brazil gained more access to basic services and technology, such as the internet, they originally desired to be part of Orchid. Their presence on social network was not well received by first adopters, people from upper classes, who had created several communities on Orchid geared towards making fun of the way poor people use the platform. In such communities, these rich first adopters mocked the poor's online and offline habits, deeming their posts low educated. There were even a few websites such as Pérolas do Orchid or Gems from Orchid, dedicated to finding and documenting such gems and disseminating them with mocking words and out of context comments. So you can imagine why they didn't want to be on Orchid, as expressed by Alice. She said, I'm not on Orchid. I wanted to be on as many sites as possible because I want to communicate with everyone. But I had to quit Orchid. I did not feel comfortable there. There were several communities mocking poor people from the favelas. When you first look at those photos, they seem funny, but then you realize that you could be on those photos. I left Orchid before they found my stuff, and now I'm just on Face. So the lower classes' access and behavior on Orchid was labeled as orcotização or orcotization. The term was later extended to label things that became too popular, that were accessed by the poor and that were deteriorated by their habits, and was used to refer to online and offline places and events. As mentioned by Alice, the orcotization was one of the reasons why some of my informants moved to Facebook. But the social media migration amplified the prejudice as upper classes users were complaining of the orcotization of Facebook. So in Brazil, for example, as we were gaining more, let's say, low-fare airlines, like we had our versions of Ryanair and EasyJet, they said, oh, airplanes became orcotized, because the poor were having access to airplanes. Despite the present prejudice, favela residents still ventured on Facebook and gained their own groups. Facebook groups became popular, especially with favela teenagers, as they perceived it as a way to freely communicate with friends and other teenagers from the same social class without feeling judgment. Some teenagers went beyond the communicative aspect of groups and shared self-made digital content in order to become what were called famosinhos, which means famous teenagers. The famous teens were the most popular teenagers from the favelas. They dictated fashion trends among teens within the favelas and actively cultivated their reputation by producing videos and content to promote ostentation. In other words, by showing off their Nike or Puma shoes, expensive brand t-shirts, such as Paulo Freire or Tommy Hilfiger, or even their thick gold necklace. Such access to material good puts them in a higher power position when compared to other teenagers who would become the fans of these famous teens. João, 17 years old, summarized how he became a famosinho. He said, "They say that being famous on Facebook is like being rich in the board game Monopoly. The money's useless. But it doesn't matter because I have this." He would show off his clothes. "I want to be like those MCs from funk. My fans look up to me, give me lots of respect, and I earned it. I spent several hours at the telecenter and I attended the workshops to learn new tools to be creative. Now I can make videos and talk for my peers, talk about what we want and what we need. Being a famosinho also gives me the opportunity to fight for what we want." So famosinhos from the favelas organized meetings on Facebook so they could hang out with friends and meet their fans. These meetings were called rolezinhos, or the little strolls. At first, the rolezinhos were taking place in public squares in the favelas, but they turned out to be popular enough that the famous teenagers felt empowered to organize the strolls in local shopping malls. However, in Brazil, shopping malls provide more than an act of entertainment or a place to hang out, but they also function as a situated activity where the upper class demonstrated their purchasing power in social location. In other words, that's where white and rich people hang out. The malls were located centrally in the cities and not in the favelas, which means crossing social boundaries. The strolls were not well received, and the famosinhos and their fans were soon labeled as troublemakers, thieves, and rioters because they were in big groups and were targeted as favelados, which means favelados is a derogatory term in Portuguese that means uncivilized and too dark for malls. Although favela residents wanted to make a statement of inclusion in what was understood as a democratic space, they realized that they were not welcome in places of wealthy people. So the rolezinho of November 2013 didn't end well. What was supposed to be a fun stroll ended up with poor and black bodies being tamed and put to humiliation as a statement that Brazil was a place that diversity was celebrated, but diverse bodies should stay in their designated spaces. Rolezinho was a phenomenon that helped me understand that favela residents were not only marginalized due to their social conditions, but they were also marginalized by place, both online, Orchid, and offline, physical, like in the malls. It functioned as a point of control over favela residents. The prejudice suffered by the favela residents in the shopping malls was similar to what they experienced on Orchid. As explained before, the upper class did not seem to want to be in the same situation where they had the same power and affordances as the poor, and did not want online or offline boundaries to be crossed. So this is just an example to show you how much technology can do for the poor. It can empower them to create content, be very creative, give this fake sense of empowerment so they can cross social boundaries. But when it comes in a situation like this, where they hang out in a shopping mall, technology can't really include them socially. So this is just to show not only that malls were a place of hate and exclusion, but also shows how how limited is the power of technology in terms of promoting social inclusion. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the other case that happened parallel to this, which was the protest in June 2013. So an avalanche of protests led more than 1 million people to take the streets in over 100 cities in Brazil. The protests were motivated by a 20-cent increase in fare for public transportation and grew to include a much larger set of issues faced by the Brazilian society. Brazilians were fed up with politicians and the government due to the corruption and the cost of hosting the upcoming World Cup and the Olympic Games. The billions of dollars invested in these sport events were far from matching the investments in precarious public health care, education, and the violence. In Victoria, the first protest took place in June 17th. University students and members of the Brazilian middle class organized this protest. They used Facebook to form two popular groups. I participated in the protest march to observe the events. I was not able to identify anyone from the favelas. The protesters were mostly white and wore clothes that resembled typical upper-class citizens. Ironically, they were protesting for a better and more inclusive society, but they also marginalized the favela residents in things like the shopping malls, as explained by Thais. She says, I heard about the protests in Rio and São Paulo on TV, but heard nothing about the one that happened here. Even if I had, why would I go there? To get beat up by the cops? We already get enough of that here in the community. So due to the large number of participants on June 17th, the protest organizers gained interest and attention from mainstream media, and they announced a new protest for June 20th. Since the information about the new protest was available through less exclusive and mass channels, like mainstream media and like radio and TV channels, the favela residents became interested and organized their own group on Facebook. The protest of June 20th made history by gathering more than 100,000 protesters in the streets of Victoria, so that's 1/3 of the population of the city. This formed the largest public demonstration ever registered in the state of Espírito Santo. I also joined these protests with 21 favela residents. They demanded better living conditions in the favelas, more respect as citizens, and they called for an end to the drug war in their communities. But it was too late for them, as explained by Pedro. He said, we get here and everything's already set up. It doesn't matter how loud we scream, no one will hear us. They, the protest organizers, don't care about the drug war in the favelas or the chaotic situation we live in. They just want to demand what is convenient to them. I don't feel that I'm fully contributing to this protest. I'm just another person here. It's an illusion, and I don't feel like I'm coming back. So, the protests of June 2013 were a good example of such social segregation. The organizers of the first protest belonged to an upper class that did not overlap with lower class, online and offline, and thus the marginalized joining to the streets and their voices and requests were not as privileged as the ones shouted in the rich. So basically, the challenge, what I'm trying to challenge it here is this idea that social media will connect different pockets of the society that don't seem to connect offline, hence they will connect online, which is not true. So this is an example of how like folks from the middle class organized in a very democratic way, so social protests, but the information never traveled. Like there was never a tie that connected those two different pockets in society, those different classes. So the information never traveled to the poor. So that's why the poor came in too late. And when they joined this protest, it was too late for them. They could not be part of the agenda setting of this protest. So everything that they were asking for was what the middle class wanted, which doesn't really match what the favela people deserve and was requested. So the question is, even though the poor weren't able to actively participate in defining the agenda of the protest, they helped these demonstrations grow to something the country has never seen before. The demands were still sounding very progressive and inclusive and nonpartisan, where people were demanding from politicians better schools, health care, and the violence and end of corruption. So the question is, yes, the poor or the folks from the favelas were not able to participate in the genocide. However, the protests, for those who have been following Brazil, they still seem very progressive, given that people were claiming there was a non-partisan, did not belong to a specific party. Everybody was welcome. So there was this sense of change, this sense of progress. That it seemed like Brazilians were fed up. So the question is, how did we go from that to Bolsonaro, right? Because it seemed like it was giving hopes to us that we're finally waking up. There was even that saying that the giant had finally woken up, and now the Brazilian people are standing up for their rights, the end of corruption, which is all good, but then Bolsonaro happened. So what really happened? Well, I'll tell you, many things happened. As you can see, it shouldn't be a surprise, given that even though we were having these progressive movements, these hidden places of racism were still happening. But what truly caught my attention was the rise of groups and leaderships that piggybacked the enormous sense of change to skew the discourse of these protests by bringing claims such as the political class or the establishment didn't represent them, that the common man were being crushed by political correctness and bureaucracies. And it sounds a little familiar to what happened here with Brexit. And this is not only about what happened in the US in 2016 or here with Brexit, but also there seems to be a pattern where extreme groups take advantage of this sense of change to piggyback and change the agenda of these movements. So it happened in the US, for example, in the Occupy Wall Street movement. Have you guys heard of them? Yeah, so the Occupy Wall Street movement was something that was seen as the left, but the whole discourse around we're not the 1%, we're the 99%. The 1% was later classified as the politicians, as the establishment, whereas the 99%, some groups were able to frame that into the white men who are working, middle class, being crushed by the establishment. Hence, that sense of rise of the excluded white people came around folks in Appalachia, in Kentucky, in Tennessee. That's why they see themselves aligned with the far-right movement, in the sense that they were able to bring those sentiments that they are the ones being excluded. We see the same thing happening now in France with the yellow vests. That we thought the yellow vests were some sort of a breath of fresh air, given how progressive they were. But now, if you look at them, they seem very scary in the sense of what they are demanding. Right? They're not. They're always looking for reasons to go back to say that the white Frenchmen are being crushed by bureaucrats in Europe and all that rhetoric that really well. So, and that's what happened in Brazil. So for those who don't know, this is Kim Kataguiri. He is the leader of a movement called Movimento Brasil Livre, which is the Free Brazil movement. He came to the stage. He rose when he became one of the voices of the people saying, you know, we need to get rid of the establishment. We need to have a less bureaucratic country. He would never talk about communism and socialism as he does now. But anyways, he came to the spotlight by bringing this alternative view of how the country should be turned to, which was like this open and free space. But now he's a congressman and in our Congress. So much for being anti-establishment, and he is capitalizing over all the benefits that politicians in Brazil have. For example, now he has an office that is dedicated to create memes and disseminate misinformation. Let's see where I am right now before I get lost. Yes, so what I just mentioned about the Occupy movement, MBL or Yellow Vest, it's not new. So Paulo Freire is one of the theorists out there that have identified how the oppressor joins the oppressed, as the oppressed is always looking for ways to be saved or ways to save, their spaces, and by joining them, the oppressor always find ways and tools to bring the oppressed to their side and fight for their own, for their needs, the needs of the oppressor, not the needs of the oppressed. So I bring a lot of Paulo Freire into my work to sort of like unpack these understandings of how the oppressor is always able to bring the oppressed to their sides and fight for them and just like sit back and watch everything that happens. So the NBL, as I mentioned before, it was really interesting to see how they were engaged with new media to recruit people. So they had their own channels, and they convinced and killed any attempt to deconstruct those their own group. These groups, like such as MBL, started on Facebook with a spread of sensational short clips and memes. But in 2016, with the decline of new users on Facebook, especially with folks from the younger generations, they moved their channels of communication to YouTube. And then finally, in 2018, during Brazil's elections, these groups moved to WhatsApp, which is really interesting. I was just talking to Chico how I thought the political conversations and the spread of misinformation in Brazil was going to happen in Twitter, which it didn't. I tried to get Twitter's license or ID permission to scrape data from them. I didn't get it. They were actually cracking down on these permissions from other researchers, which worked as a blessing to me, because then I looked for other channels of communication and went to WhatsApp, and that was actually where these groups were being very active and creating, consuming, and producing misinformation. So last year, as I I decided to investigate this further to sort of understand why Brazil was going for Bolsonaro. I spent about 5 months on 3 WhatsApp groups. I was getting about 1,000 messages a day. So it was from memes, videos, to emojis, especially the one with the hand like this, which was labeled as the gun hand. And I was not quantifying this, but actually I had an approach of what's being called the ethnography of big data, where the big data is actually telling me the story of what is happening in these groups. So every day before bed, I would just read about 1,000 messages. It was rough, but then I quantified and qualified all the data that I was receiving in order to understand the social infrastructure or the human infrastructure behind the creation, consumption, and the spread of misinformation. What was interesting was that in Brazil, there was an attempt to classify Bolsonaro fans or Bolsonaro supporters as the stereotypical white man. However, that was not true, as was one of the findings that I got from this research. I came up with three groups, and the majority in these groups were what I call the average Brazilian. So in these groups, you could find people that belong to any of those social classes. So you could find people from the favelas, you could find people from upper classes, you could find blacks, browns, whites, people from all kinds of spectrum, the racial spectrum. You could find lots of folks who belong to LGBTQ groups, which was surprising to me. But these people were mostly interested in knowing and learning more about Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was the new thing in the election, so people really wanted to know more information. They were already convinced that they were going to vote for him, so they needed content, they needed things to sort of like giving them the affirmation and justification to vote for Bolsonaro. The second group was what I call the Bolsominion, which is not a term that I clenched. It was something that was already in the media for quite some time. This makes them absolutely mad, but it's how I explain it, it's the Voluntary Army. They're the ones who make sure to spread the misinformation, the fake news everywhere, not only on WhatsApp, but also on Facebook, on Twitter. So the fake news or the misinformation being shared on Twitter and Facebook, they were already consumed on WhatsApp, because that's where those misinformation was first shared. So if I were on Facebook or Twitter, I was already looking at the tip of the iceberg, whereas on WhatsApp, that's where it was starting the conversations. They work just like the beehive. I don't know if you guys heard of the beehive phenomenon. Is if you ever say something bad about Beyonce on the internet, the beehive will find you, will destroy your online reputation. That has been theorized, actually, and they behave in the same pattern. They will pretty much go through YouTube videos, anything that has a political content on the internet in Brazil, and try to see if there's anything related to Bolsonaro, and if it's something that is empowering to Bolsonaro, they will leave it alone. But if there's something bad, then they will try to deconstruct whatever was written and try to make a different statement that Bolsonaro was not bad. Try to deconstruct. But anyways, they are the ones who would make sure to get every content of misinformation and spread all over the internet. The hardest group to find was the influencers. They were very subtle. They would come in every day and just like dip in, share the misinformation that they created. So it could be either a meme, a video, or anything, and leave. They won't say a single word. And in an ocean of messages, it would be almost impossible to see who was spreading that. And they knew that by just dropping that into the groups, that the Bolsominions will catch that and spread as far as possible. So they were really safe in the sense that they did not need to do any work of spreading misinformation, because they could only focus on creating, because they knew that Bolsominion would spread that information and the average Brazilian would consume that misinformation. So just to give, I know that I missed the slide here, but just to give an example of how ridiculous the misinformation created by them was in Brazil, was something that became sort of famous was the baby bottle with the dildo on top. They were claiming that the Workers' Party would bring this to public schools in Brazil as a part of the gender ideology plan, meaning that the Workers' Party had a plan to turn every kid into gay, lesbian, transgender, hence like the gender ideology. It was part of a gay kit that the government would spread in schools.
I wanted to ask, the maniacs and the influencers, do they kind of like have any formal funding? Because we had this sort of stuff in Nigeria. We just came out of a very divisive election.
Mhm.
We had these two kind of guys, but of course they had formal funding from both leading parties. So do they have any kind of formal funding?
That's a great question. So that is the next step. Because right now, so I have enough data and I'm convinced that these were literally volunteers. They were not getting paid. Unfortunately, I had friends who belonged in this group, but of course I try to stay away from any personal informant or anything, just in these groups. But it was a behavior that I was able to theorize that it was voluntary. This group, however, I don't know. And given the time, effort, and the quality and how precise it was to deliver the message, I don't think they were voluntary. You know, there is something behind them, but I cannot say 100% for sure because that's the next step. I'm going after them. So we'll see. Hopefully, in a couple of months I'll have a better answer. But yeah, so there was this war on this made-up gender ideology that they were bringing up.
Just before you move on, you said that the first group was already convinced, the average Brazilian guy, which actually represents almost my entire family, but they were already convinced to vote for Bolsonaro. They were looking for, I don't know, some motives online. Did you get to know what motivated them in the first place to vote for Bolsonaro? Like, how did they come convinced to vote for Bolsonaro? Was it just like the anti-establishment feeling and Bolsonaro capitalized on that? I mean, what convinced them in the first place?
Yeah. So for those who don't know, in Brazil, the elections happen as in the first round. It's pretty much everybody against everybody. Anyone can run. If you have a political affiliation, you can run for president. And then we get the runoff for the second round, which is the two most voted people go head to head. So the person who advanced against Bolsonaro belonged to the PT, the Workers' Party. And because the Workers' Party, the Dilma and Lula, they were involved in corruption schemes in the past, and there was this feeling that the reason why Brazil was immersed in a crisis, the currency, the dollar was too expensive, everything was blamed on PT. So created this rhetoric that, if there's anything wrong in your life, blame Workers' Party. So this anti-Workers' Party sentiment was the strongest thing, even stronger than the pro-Bolsonaro feeling. So people were already set that they were not going to vote for Haddad, which was the Workers' Party representative. So if you're not voting for him, you only have one option, which was Bolsonaro. Hence, them not really knowing what he was standing for and needed more information, more of their information. And the problem is, by not being so informed by who he was and getting all this crazy nonsense misinformation, what happened was they were still going to vote for him, but the worst part of this was the polarization of the country. So the country has been polarized in a sense that we've never seen anything like this before. I don't know if that relates to what you saw in your family, but that's exactly what I saw in my family. That was disheartening. It was awful.
But Bolsonaro almost won in the first round. It was a little bit difference to win in the first. He was 48% in the first round.
Of the ballot votes or the total?
Yeah, ballot votes.
Because I don't think he got that close, did he? I can't remember the numbers.
Yeah, 48.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and I remember towards the last 2 weeks, there was already this rumor that I saw on WhatsApp. I was able to catch how they perceived that the left, meaning everybody else, even parties like Novo, which are libertarians, or PSDB, which are known to be in the right in the political spectrum, they started to spread this news that all the other political parties would get together to go against Bolsonaro. So people who are going to vote for the other candidates went for Bolsonaro because they thought that if he runs for the second runoff, like the second round, then PT would win. So we need to make sure that he wins in the second round. That's why if you follow the trajectory of the votes, the last 2 weeks are a major jump because there was that fear that maybe Haddad had a chance.
Mhm.
But yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
It was towards the end that there was that jump.
I was wondering which criteria did you apply to the content of the message that you received to decide what was misinformation and fake news and which was not?
Right.
And because this is clearly like fake.
Yes.
But there's some kind of borderline news that could be polarizing but not
Right,
fake, or
exactly.
could be just like some different interpretations of the same news, and how did you do this kind of classification?
Yes, that's a great question. And I can share this with you later. There's a list of news portals out there that were classified as fake news portals, and things that were self-made. So it didn't come from, let's say, for example, Brazil 247, right? We know it's a left-leaning press, so that can be a little biased, but it's not fake news, right? However, so I wouldn't classify that as anywhere in the fake news spectrum. But if the links were coming from news from the center of the world, that was a website, there's a website like this, then yes. So I did a pre-screening of the websites. You're right in the sense that there were content that I was not able to classify, and I didn't want to push it either. So I came up with a code book that was very strict based on this previous research that I did. So it was either links that belonged to this list of websites that I had, or content that was made by these folks that I identified.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but OAI has a computational propaganda project that has some kind of similar kind of typology applied
Yeah.
to news content based on the source of the news.
Mhm.
But when we are trying to categorize images, that was really difficult to
Yes.
apply the typology, because one, you can like identify the source in terms of URL,
Yeah.
and so it has to be much more of a qualitative approach than a quantitative in terms of classifying fake news, not fake news. And so I was curious to know
Absolutely,
what
and
the
hence
criteria
my
applied.
choice of going with ethnography of big data than coming up with a quantitative or systematic way of classifying that. Because I think it's really hard to define that line, and it really depends on that human touch. That's why content moderation is so hard.